Welcome to the Medical Device Innovators podcast. On this episode, we have a great guest, Steve Levine from is it Dassault, I guess is who you're working with?
Dassault?
Dassault, yes.
Yes.
As I try to run the American version through.
Yeah, exactly. It's a family name, so we try to get it right.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And Steve, can you give us a little bit of background? How you ended up where you're at and where you're at today?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start from where I'm at, and I'll work backwards. So I'm currently leading what we call virtual human modeling here at Dassault Systèmes. It's a project initiative, really, that I started maybe about 10 years ago. Prior to that, I was actually leading the strategy for the simulation brand called Simulia at Dassault Systèmes. I joined Dassault when they formed that brand. It was formed in 2006 with the acquisition of Abacus and the formulation of that brand, which is now a fully multi-physics brand. And as we were growing our strategy to go beyond the core computational modeling industries of heavy manufacturing, automotive, and aero, I looked out into the world to see where are the next range of impact where I thought simulation could really have an impact. And I recognized that healthcare was really of important territory. In the end, the body obeys the laws of physics, just like airplanes and cars. And I thought if we could model and provide to doctors the same kind of capabilities and researchers that we provide to engineers and designers, that we'd be able to come up with more innovative solutions, higher efficiency in terms of success of clinical trials, because we could try things out in a more human-like environment beforehand. And so I launched that initiative about 10 years ago. Okay, and is your background in engineering, or is it how did you end up here? So if we go way back, my background, I have a PhD in material science, and I did computational modeling, looking at atomistic level modeling of materials back. And during that PhD, what I learned was about how to model the basic principles of how something works by putting it together with the most fundamental building blocks. Of course, I started with atoms back then and then moved up the scale. But I recognized that each scale, you could predict how something would behave by the inputs. And so you had to get the inputs right to be able to get the right outputs. And I've used that over my career. I worked in industry for a number of years. I joined a startup in the early 90s where we were looking at biological systems and looking at things like how to create new engineered materials. So this was in the early days of silicon chips and things like that. And we were looking at things like how the defects in a chip propagate to the surface of silicon and disturb the electrical properties, which of course was really in the emerging computer era. A lot of things we take for granted now, but back then those were very difficult scientific topics. And when I moved to Dassault Systèmes, I really stepped up the length scale and started to look much more on the continuum level. But the strategy of the brand was to bring in that entire multi-scale modeling capability. So I had really had expertise at the low end, the micro scale. I learned after 10 years working in the world of the continuum space how to leverage that. And I put those two pieces together, and that's what really is essential for modeling the human body. You have to look at the biological scale as well as at the physical organ level. And that's really what I set out to do with my initiative.
Right. Yeah. So that leads me to a whole bunch of questions, but I'm going to have to step back for a second and remind myself there are people here that haven't spent their entire life in simulation or even in the medical field. I want to define a couple of things that are going to come up as we go along. The first one is a digital twin.
Okay. So a digital twin draws its origins from basically the NASA aerospace program, when they were trying to understand what was happening to the spacecraft in space. They created a copy down on Earth, and the computer capabilities back in the day, they had, of course, rudimentary computer capabilities, and power was really careful. You couldn't burn any more energy than necessary. And so to guide the NASA spaceships in space, they created a digital copy of what the processor would go through. So they tested out all the different sequences in the digital copy. And then once they knew that they had the right sequence, they then transferred it up to space. And fortunately, that helped them get home. And so that became a standard going beyond just the electrical signals, and actually in the aerospace industry that adopted it first, building complete, fully functional three-dimensional models of a plane where you could fly it. You could understand how all of the dimensions, dynamics of the plane, or a car. So you could crash it, you could drive it and understand the vibrations, you could understand the safety. And so we moved from physical prototypes to digital prototypes, where you could have all the power of the virtual reality, artificial intelligence, computational physics, all at your fingertips to be able to know how something would behave before you actually build it. And then as it's matured, as you get real world data, as they did from NASA, if you're driving in a car, you can actually get feedback from the sensors in the car. That then feeds the digital model, which can then be updated. So the digital twin not only can predict what happens before you build it, but it can actually help you maintain and predict the maintenance. For example, all of the engines that fly on commercial jets have digital twins where they predict the maintenance sequence based on the sensors that come back. So they don't wait for something to fail, they monitor it in the digital twin. And of course, there's a completely direct analogy to the work that I'm doing in trying to create what we actually call a virtual twin. There's a subtle difference. I can talk about that in a little bit, but the idea is that virtual twin can help you understand how to maintain your body if we can actually build it.
Oh, okay. And the related term that I wanted to kind of get out of the way to start with is in silico. So that's a term that comes up in our circles, but not many places else I've seen it. So
yeah, so it really draws its roots from, of course, it's Latin. It draws its roots from the pharmaceutical industry that began or uses basically two terms. The earliest phase work in the medical community, they called in vivo. So they would test right in the living person. So whether it was an animal or a human, they would do all the testing on a human body from the Latin. As they learned how to create laboratory looking at cells and genomics, they started to call in vitro, or in the lab. And so those were all the modes of testing that exist primarily until you start to be able to create these computational models. And so the third and newest phase of testing is on the computer or in silico. And so it's complementary to in vivo, in vitro, in silico. And these are all models for how the body will react to a treatment.
And that's used in the development of not only pharmaceuticals, but also devices and pretty much anything that's developed before.
Yeah, so now the term has become, now that we've all become very comfortable with computers, computer models, virtual reality, we understand the virtual reality is built in a computer. And so the term in silico has become fairly popular for essentially any way that we evaluate medical treatments. And of course, very popular in medical devices now.
So you had alluded to the not digital twin, but virtual twin, and the difference between the two.
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes up a lot, and of course, these terms, they tend to be often interchangeable. There's sometimes they're used like marketing terms, things like the metaverse. They effectively convey a message to what we believe we're talking about. We like the term virtual because it captures the real flexibility of the virtual world. We really think of the computer as an extension of your mind. So you don't really think of your imagination as being digital. It's really, you have a virtual image in your head of an idea, a concept of how something's going to work. And what we try to do is translate that virtual concept that you have into the computer so it's now more functional. So the virtual idea, of course, it's fed by digital information, but it's a virtual replica of what you're thinking with all the power of what other people are thinking combined into it. And so, of course, it's also now a tangible item that you can share, you can operate on, you can use to predict, you can do way more than what you can do in your mind, but you can connect with it and have all the flexibility you have in your head to try out new ideas. And so it really captures the flexibility of what we understand as the virtual world and your own imagination.
So this has applications not only for those working in the clinical space, but those developing new treatments, new devices, new pharmaceuticals. The advantages to using virtual twins. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's got to be a ton.
Yeah, it's as I spend time doing this, I become more and more. Well, of course, I see the evidence, but I'm more and more convinced how powerful and how important it is. So my first attempt to really demonstrate the virtual twin is both possible and valuable was a project that I called the Living Heart Project, which was, I launched back in 2014 as a way of seeing if I could bring together all of the various experts, the different disciplines, the research community, the clinical community, the industrial community, regulatory community, all having different perspectives and pieces of the puzzle for how, in this case, the human heart worked, and see if we could bring that together into a virtual twin of the heart. And it was incredibly successful. And I can go into more detail in a little bit where we are with that. But what we learned was that the virtual twin became the common language that everyone could understand how the heart was working by bringing it together at a fully functioning organ. That the folks studying tissue mechanics could understand how the constitutive laws changed the way the motion behaved and why that was important to health, because the doctors could then explain it and they could understand why the material properties or the constitutive laws or the shape of the fibers or the flexibility of the valves, all of those pieces all were taken in isolation, but all of a sudden, once we put them together, now people could understand. And our minds are so much more capable of understanding things when we see it in 3 dimensions. It's the way we evolved. So our brains evolved over millions of years of seeing things in 3 dimensions. And when we have it in 2 dimensions, we lose so much of our capability. And so we know that a lot of innovation comes from doctors who are in the clinic interacting with patients, trying to solve a problem. They say, hey, I see a problem. I can imagine if I could do this, I could fix it. Well, if we can replicate that doctor's experience in the lab, so the researchers can say, well, let me take my virtual twin of the patient, replicate the problem, have the same experience that the doctor was having. Now I can imagine, okay, now I can see the problem, I can see what it does. Let me try out solutions. And that is the most powerful way to innovate and to get quickly, because now you can communicate with the clinicians, you can try out your examples, and you ultimately will eliminate this challenge of translating what might work in the lab or might work on an animal into what will work on a human.
And I imagine that being able to communicate that clearly to patients becomes a big comfort for them, understanding what the next treatment's going to be, what the changes are that they're going to be made to their heart, that sort of thing, and what the impact of that will be on their overall health.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most exciting part of the Living Heart Project now, because it's so advanced. The model is quite effective at capturing more or less any kind of disease. We're using it to look at congenital heart defects, which is particularly powerful because now we're talking about young children who have very complex conditions that the families can't understand. They want to be able to protect their children, but if they can't even understand the problem, it's massive and there's a huge amount of anxiety. And so I've seen so much positive feedback from when we can actually show, using things like virtual reality, a beating heart, an exact replica of that patient's heart or the condition that they have. Here's a normal heart, here's your heart, here's what's different, here's where the problem is, here's what we're going to do to it to fix it. It's very simple. We're going to replace this with that, and here's what will happen in the end. And it demystifies so many things, and we've gotten so much positive feedback from the families that we've talked to. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Yeah. So in the beginning, I know that one of the biggest concerns people have around modeling biological systems like this is that they're just too complex to model. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this over and over again when it comes to things. Looking back and knowing where you are now, clearly, it's modeled well enough to be a great tool to be used. But what are some of the hurdles that you had to overcome in the Living Heart Project to kind of deal with that complexity?
Yeah. Well, interesting. See how much time we have to talk about that. Well, first of all, the biggest hurdle was exactly as you described it. When we looked at the other industries that really developed this concept of the virtual twin, the automotive or aerospace industries, they looked to the virtual twin because things were so complex. They said the only way we can understand how to do it is to build a virtual twin. So these are industries that you can't tolerate the kind of success rates that you have in, say, medical devices, where half of the products fail, right? Meaning to fail to make it to market. You can't have that. If you're building commercial jets, you have to make every one of them work, and every flight has to work. We don't have that luxury in the medical device world, but we could. And so if we had to make it work all the time, what would you do? You couldn't take an animal and make it more like a human. You could try to build a laboratory test that's more like a human. But an actual practical way is to figure out how to create a virtual twin that could be like a human, because you can actually build a roadmap for it. So once I started to get people to understand that idea, that it was actually the complexity was the reason for understanding it, then everybody realized, well, if it's complex, what we need is a community of experts, because no one could understand each individual piece. That's why we deconstruct complex problems into components, and then we solve the components. So the biggest challenge was bringing all those different people together to work on a single model, because so many people had been working on various pieces. They targeted one part of the cardiovascular system, one function, one disease. I set out to bring them all together and say, this model has to work for all of you. And to get them to buy into the idea that they could contribute to something bigger, and not have complete control over, well, I'm going to I'm going to study just my piece, that their model had to work in the context of someone else's problem. And if it didn't, then they didn't quite have it right. And that took a lot of iteration with people to get comfortable with that, because we know that people will always say, well, these are my limitations of my study. In my case, I said, well, we have to overcome those limitations. You can't just document them. We actually have to overcome them. And so that's kept us going. That's why, I think in many ways we've covered many hurdles. The models that we create are now in use in automotive, in the medical device industry and the pharma industry. It's being used in hospitals now to predict outcomes. So we've made great progress, but it's that complexity that keeps us going, because we're just beginning to really tackle some of the most challenging problems, like systemic problems. We know the heart doesn't work in isolation of the lungs, even of the mind. When we get excited, our heart rate speeds up. Well, we have to take that into account. So if you don't have that feedback system, you're not fully reflecting the full behavior of the heart. So we still have those hurdles to overcome.
So is that the current state of that project? I mean, I hesitate to keep calling it the Living Heart Project, because I know, like you said, now there's other major organ systems that are involved.
Yeah, no, that's a very exciting part, because when I launched the Living Heart Project, as I said, it was with the hope that we would demonstrate it's both possible and meaningful, and that other communities would sort of copy our template and see if we could replicate that throughout other communities. And that's really what we've seen. So the Living Brain community has organized the liver. We just launched this year. Last year, we launched the Living Lung. And so all of these independent sort of organ systems are all being built. And what we're doing, of course, is the kind of hub for all the organs, using our platform, which was developed to bring together, for example, if you're building a commercial jet, there's no one company that builds a commercial jet. There are about 1,000 different companies that build part of a Boeing or an Airbus jet. Someone's building the engine, someone's building the tail, someone's building the wings. All has to fit together functionally. And of course, that's where the virtual twin is critical. And of course, so we have this platform that's capable of putting together all those pieces. And so by coordinating the communities all doing these virtual organs, we're able to put together a system model for how the organs start to interact. And so that's really where I've been putting my focus, is trying to build that that system, and collecting the data and realizing what data we don't have, which is always part of the goal of this, is to use the virtual twin to differentiate between what we know, what we think we know, and what we don't know. And that guides our testing to be able to validate what we think we know, but we're not sure, and to run the right experiments to fill the gaps for what we don't know. And hopefully, and what we've seen from the Living Heart and the Living Brain, by putting that information out in the open system, so it's an open project, everybody can see what we're doing. The entire research community can identify the gaps necessary, and so collectively, with the heart, we have more than 400 people working together. So they're looking, and each year when we get together, people identify which gaps are still open, and then some research group can go off, fill that gap, publish the information, and now everybody can directly use the information in the model. And so we kind of have that snowball effect.
So if you have the system that kind of allows these different models to talk to each other and collaborate together and look at things at different scales, time scales, or even measurement scales. Mm-hmm. What's kind of the overall vision of where you would see this going? When is it done, or is it ever done? I guess.
Yeah. Well, what comes with building system models, of course, is that we're pretty much moving out of the lab. and back into the real world. So, of course, we get a lot of data from the real world, but the systemic data really needs to come from clinical trials, controlled system response. So we're working, so the vision is to really, at least for the foreseeable future, to try to adapt the clinical trial process so that instead of simply saying, well, let's put it in a bunch of people and see what happens, let's model it in what we call an in silico clinical trial. So we build the trial first on the virtual patients, we predict what will happen, then we run the trial, and we build and we check our models of those patients against what happened in the real world, and then we can adjust and update based on what we learned. And that's where we can fine tune the organ response, the biological response, and of course, then we'll be able to get the systemic response as we start to mature those models. And so over time, the hope is that as those models become more and more mature, the number of actual humans that you need in a clinical trial will go down. So we'll change from what we have today, which is 100% human verification, to and 0% virtual prediction. We'll go from, 80% virtual prediction and then 20% validation. So we'll always still need to test in humans, but let's get to the point where we only need to test in, say, 20%, and the other 80% are actual virtual.
So the development's all done on this in silico side, and the verification and validation side of that is really done just, once the design is finished or whatever, you right. you say we're really confident that this is going to work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you also have much more precision in what patients you're looking for, what reaction you're trying to find, because you've predicted it, and not just in an animal where, some animal models are good replications of what happens in the humans, but most of those we've already solved. What we're running into now, of course, is that the animal models are not serving us for the complexity of devices that we have today, smart devices, the ability to take all that data and ultimately apply what we're all hearing about as artificial intelligence methods to actually take everything we're learning from the virtual twin and apply it to very rapid techniques. So you can diagnose a patient immediately using the AI, because the AI has been trained on a cohort of real patients. The same way a doctor might be trained over 20 years after seeing thousands and thousands of patients so they can diagnose. Let's train the AI on virtual patients, because that's one of the limitations that we're seeing. Of course, AI is very powerful, but it's only as good as the information you provide it. And the clinical record that they're trained on doesn't have any information about human physiology. It doesn't know how the human body works. So it's missing those factors. But if we can replace it, so if we can create these cohorts, we can simplify the clinical trial process, make it faster, more predictable, less expensive, and then give all that knowledge then to the clinicians in the form of an AI tool that they can immediately say, okay, here, give me your patient. We've trained the AI to diagnose that patient and tell you whether this treatment is going to work, or exactly what size, shape, or dosage.
So we talked a little bit about the development side. We talked a little bit about the clinical application side and planning there with huge benefits to using virtual twins. What about the regulatory side? I mean, that's kind of the gatekeepers to all of this, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's exciting and also, of course, challenging. The regulatory folks, particularly on the medical device side, because they've looked at their peers in the automotive and aerospace industries, which are also regulated, highly regulated. And in those industries, the virtual twin is required. You can't bring a new plane to market unless you present the virtual twin data. They require that because they know they've learned how to interpret it, and they've learned how to use it to predict the future, which you can't do when you're looking at laboratory tests, and clinical trials become expensive the longer you run them. So it's clear, there's a clear benefit if you can learn how to to create virtual twins that are reliable enough to be predictive. And so they recognize, certainly, as I said, the folks that I've been working with a lot in the CDRH on the medical device side, they recognize the benefits, the potential benefits of this technology if the industry can mature to the right level. And so I've worked very closely because of the community that we've been able to build around the Living Heart Project. We've been able to work with them to actually take the heart model and do kind of what I just said, to actually build an entire cohort of patients. In this case, we looked at replicating the pivotal trial for the mitral valve or the MitraClip device, because we know there's a lot of interest. Mitral valve is extremely complex anatomy, and that's been a particular challenge to the community to come up with innovative solutions, particularly non-invasive replacement valves. There really are none that are approved yet because of the complexity of the valve, having to deal with all the systems. And so the FDA was hoping that we could demonstrate how to use a virtual trial, an in silico clinical trial using virtual patients to augment, or in our case, enrich. We actually called the trial enrichment, with the purpose of saying, well, let's collect the right data. Let's get the right patients so you don't have the problem of saying, okay, we run a trial for 3 years. Looks like we didn't quite get the right cohort. Now we wasted however many millions of dollars in 3 years. Now we have to do another one. And so it takes 10 years for the product to come to market. If the virtual twins can make sure we get the right patients the first time, that can shorten the process and train the regulators how to interpret the model. We all recognize that even a clinical trial is a model for a population. The virtual patients are a model of a model, and so each one has its assumptions, its potential errors, and degree of validity. And establishing those bounds and being able to understand how to do that is one of the top priorities of the FDA.
So being able to do these in silico clinical trials requires a whole range of in silico patients, right? From very young pediatric patients to very old. There's a lot of variability between patients. Are you modeling these on specific people or on like subsets of the population along the way, or does that matter?
Well, it does matter. It's been very interesting along the way with, again, I'll stick with the heart, how little, coming from the engineering world, let me step back, where there are handbooks and, the industry has organized themselves to really be very precise on the range of how to characterize any particular material or process. When you look at something like the human heart and say, okay, well, we all know it has 4 valves, 4 chambers, et cetera. But if you went and said, okay, well, tell me what is the range of a left ventricle in the human body? There's no standard for that. It's never been documented. It's never been systematically studied. And so for us to be able to say, well, now we've actually covered the range of human anatomy, we can't be sure that we actually have that. So there are good examples now where you can guesstimate the range. You can talk to clinicians, and if there's clinicians that's been around for 30 years, they've pretty much seen the entire range. They can tell you, yeah, you'll never see one that's bigger than this. You never see one that's smaller than that. It's in the minds of the clinicians, and so we're extracting it from those, those experts. and kind of capturing that in the range. So what we do is start with real patients, and we validate the template model based on real patients, a handful, 4 or 5. And then we use the clinical data, either if it's published or directly from clinicians, to say, okay, now let's deviate the range of all the properties to what would exist in a real patient. And then, we do a kind of design of experiments across that entire range. We also kick out, of course, the physics of the heart will say, well, certain ranges, if the tissue properties are so weak, for example, the pumping range, the contractility of the left ventricle suffers sufficiently that it won't push enough blood out, well, the patient would die, which of course happens. So it is possible, but the patient would be dead, therefore not relevant for a clinical trial. So we can identify those hearts that are definitely not realistic because they won't function, they won't produce what the body needs. So we can filter those out, and then we feed that actually into an AI system that takes all of this data and creates a statistical population of patients, tells us what's most important to the disease we care about. And then we can focus the trial on and do very detailed patients of the ones that are going to be most important to the trial. And then we replicate those. And then hopefully the next stage, which we haven't done yet, but hopefully, and I'm hoping to work with a medical device company to do this, is to be able to say, well, let's go find that patient, right? And then let's go see if we can replicate that patient and test it on that patient to make sure that we can actually, our predictions are realistic. Right now, we don't have a way of specifically validating our output. We can statistically evaluate it, and that's what we're looking for, to say, okay, are we getting about the same degree of success, the same change in this case, we're reducing regurgitation. So on average, do we have the same amount of regurgitation than that was seen in the trial? But we don't have right now, we don't have a one-to-one relationship between individual patients. But my hope is that becomes more standard practice. Instead of running a trial and just getting the end game, did the patient live or not, build that virtual twin of every patient you put into it. And so you have not just the clinical outcome, but you have all the insights about what happened during it. And that feeds your next generation of product. It feeds the understanding and the predictability, which of course is the way that it happened in the manufacturing world, is you have to go through that process of learning.
So if you can take the model and you can kind of vary the different properties and find the ones that are non-viable hearts, and you can find the ones that are kind of on the edge of that, I could see a way that you would end up predicting disease states that haven't been defined yet. I mean, has the Living Heart Project played a role in that side of things?
Well, it certainly has. Yeah, for the people in the project, as you can probably appreciate, and I alluded to this early on, is that when you're actually working with the hearts, you learn a lot about how nature has actually put the heart together, and what we realize, of course, is that heart disease in particular is a continuum, right? So doctors in the medical field will classify people. It's like a shoe size. Everybody's foot is a different size and shape, but to be practical, there's 8 shoe sizes or 12 shoe size. Everybody gets that size. And so, doctors know that in between the sizes, there's a lot of gray, but it's very hard to know what to do with it in that. And what the Living Heart actually gives you is a lot more precision in how to interpret that patient, not just say, class 4 level heart disease, but I can rank it by 16 different parameters that accurately represent that patient. And again, this is where AI can be helpful, because one of the reasons they classify it is because humans can't keep track of so many different data points. It's too complex, but the AI system can actually do that. And so we're learning the value of getting that level of precision. Now we're kind of on the rise of saying, okay, well, if we can get that kind of precision, what do we do with it? And that's where, again, I think, we're pretty excited about the analytics and the AI tools, because they can actually process it pretty effectively.
Well, that level of precision on the diagnostic side leads to that, increased precision on the treatment side, right? And so pretty soon it's, instead of, finding shoes at 8.5, you have a custom shoemaker out of all of this, right?
Exactly. And we're starting to see that now, going back to the shoe industry, because we're actually seeing that where they scan your shoe and they'll 3D print shoes. The manufacturers are doing that quite regularly. They'll doing the simpler inserts.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get custom made inserts very easily made now just by scanning it, and you get it perfectly done.
Not to reduce the whole Living Heart project to shoemaking, but
no, but
it's a good analogy.
Well, exactly. You have to learn from where people are able to solve the problems, and then increase complexity. But another example, and if we look at if we're talking about clinical treatment, and I mentioned an area that's kind of fairly interesting to me, is the congenital area, because there are. It's really infinitely variable when you're talking about congenital heart defects children, people born not with a normal heart. So adult diseases, we all have the same size, same basic shape, number of valves, system. We develop age-related cysts problems. So it's relatively predictable. But defects, of course, are now by definition abnormal. Everyone presents a unique case. And in many cases, these are life-threatening. And so we're able to work with the pediatric cardiologists to build virtual patients of that child. When you're talking about life-saving surgery, it's important to take the time to do the right surgery. And so we're building those child's anatomy. The doctors are able to now perform the surgery on the virtual twin, determine, you might come up with 10, 12, 20, 30 different possible techniques. The virtual twin can tell them which one will be best and then guide them in surgery. And that's not just theory, it's actually working in practice. So we're working with Boston Children's Hospital, where they're doing 8 or 10 of these a week now.
Wow.
With some surgeries, the most complex ones, it's effectively mandatory. In fact, at the Living Heart Project symposium that we held in December, Dr. David Hoganson came and he spoke, and one of the members asked him, how was the adoption like in the hospital? Boston Children's Hospital is the #1 pediatric cardiac hospital, probably in the world, certainly in the country. And so these are the best doctors. How do they feel about a computer, telling them what to do? And he described the process. Of course, in the early days, it was they appreciated the premise, and they appreciated the ability to see what was on the inside without opening the child up. So there was benefits just to visualization, but they didn't quite trust the predictability, which is fair. But then with practice and in using it, they found that it was not only quite predictable, but that they're at the level now where with the most complex surgeries, he said 100% of the time when the surgeon comes to me with his plan, by the time we go through the virtual patient planning, he changes his plan to something better because we find a better solution than he had come up with. So these are the best of the best, and they're still not able to do what the computer is now able to do because they've trained it. And that could be replicated anywhere in the world now. So you don't need to be the best of the best to be able to get the best surgery, because we can capture that with the virtual twin.
Yeah, the entire profession has been built on individual surgeon experience, and now you're changing the game to providing surgical planning that incorporates the experience of thousands, and will only get better as time goes on.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it gets kind of back to bringing it all back around to the virtual twin. The idea is that you don't need to be sitting in Boston to be able to get the benefits of that virtual twin. You can virtually be sitting in Cincinnati, in San Francisco, in Texas, in Egypt. It doesn't matter, in Africa. All you need to be able to do is upload the image data, build it, and then download it. And then that doctor, wherever they are virtually in the world, can get the benefit of those biomedical engineers who've learned how to do those predictions. And so, we're confident that as that starts to become more visible, well, first of all, we know it works, and that's encouraging. It doesn't work for every problem. These things take time. We have to be systematic, but we know if we take the time to be systematic and be careful, it will work. They're doing things like three-dimensional patching if they have to reconstruct, for example, a newborn's aorta. So you can imagine these are very complex anatomies. Today, to do the patching, they have to imagine in their head. The doctor looks at the shape, has about 10 minutes with the patient. They look at the shape of the aorta, they imagine what the complex three-dimensional structure needs to be for the patch. They cut it out and then sew it in and hope that child will thrive. And of course, the success rates are, quite variable, but not so great. Now they build the virtual patient. They design the patch to optimize the blood flow and the stresses exactly in the 3 dimensions in the virtual twin. We then automatically flatten the 3-dimensional object to 2 dimensions. They have a laser system in the OR that projects the 2-dimensional system right onto the patch, so it's still sterile. They cut it out, insert it directly, they get the optimum. And he said they're now getting millimeter precision with their operations now. So engineering precision on this kind of surgery that was completely variable just a year or two ago. So we're pretty optimistic that we can take care of, as we said, the complexity is not the challenge, it's really the motivator. And I think that's the hurdle we have to overcome, is to embrace it and just try to just bring the right people to the team.
I think that's a key point to this, right? Is don't run away from it because it's complex. You need to dig in,
right?
Because of the complexity, for sure.
Right. So. Yeah. Be systematic and share. I mean, one of the reasons we were successful with the Living Heart Project is everything we do is published or publishable. We don't always have the time to publish it, but no, there's no secrets. There's no black boxes. We have to be open and use the power of what everyone's learning to make it better, faster. And I think that was really the magic that we were able to do, is to really change the way people were working by not only making the information open, but immediately actionable. Because if someone publishes a model, that's great. For you to use it, you have to then recreate their model and then take their information. Then if somebody publishes a different model, well, how do you use that? Now I've got 2 models. One's solves half the problem, the other one solves the other half. So we overcame that by saying, well, let's all just work on a common model and keeping it open. So if someone's able to model dilated cardiomyopathy, once someone figures out how to do that, everybody can do it. And of course, now we're able to demonstrate a way forward.
And a lot of this seems kind of predicated on other technologies and their developments, right? Like we talked about the imaging side of things, being able to pull from non-invasive imaging, now you can pull patient-specific data and create models of those specific hearts, or the defects built into that. I imagine computational power matters a lot. I mean, if you started this 9 years ago, the computational power alone has probably changed significantly and allowed you to do more things. And then you've got things like 3D printing, like you talked about, the laser projection systems and all sorts of technologies that work in concert with your work.
Yeah, well, exactly. One of the motivating forces and the reason that the virtual twin has become so popular in other industries and is now growing in the medical field is because over time it gets cheaper, it gets faster, and it gets more powerful. The opposite of most other tools, laboratory testing, clinical trials, these things all get more expensive over time. So the more you invest in them, the more you have to invest in them. Whereas the virtual twin, it's the exact opposite. The more you invest, the faster it gets, the more accurate, it costs less. And so in principle, it has all the right dynamics. And of course, we're seeing that, what took, what might have taken 2 days to calculate 10 years ago, under 10 years ago, now can be done, in 4 or 5 hours. 10 years from now, that'll be done in 10 minutes. And so when we project out those investments, so if we look at the next 10 or 20 years, you'll be able to get almost near real-time response for how your device is working. And the heart, of course, one of the reasons we took on the heart was to take on something extremely challenging. It's hard to image, it's always moving, it's multi-physics, blood is pumping, you've got electrical signals going through it, you've got a very complex dynamic, its shape is very arbitrary compared to orthopedics, so the knee or the spine or the hip. These are complex systems, but far more straightforward in principle to be able to model. And so we're confident that if we can get the kind of focus around these communities to be able to build these reliable models, that over the next call it a decade, the cost benefit will be unequivocal. There will be no alternate choice. And of course, increasing regulatory demands, and that's really what drove the automotive industry to turn attention, was when they had sort of the combination of safety and other regulatory constraints, environmental constraints were starting to come in, and they were often at odds. Well, how do you make a car safer but also lighter? They couldn't, those seemed to be at odds with one another. And when they asked the computer, they found out how to do that. And so cars today are much lighter and also much safer because of that. And so it's those cost factors that drive you to say, okay, we need to make sure we're getting it right the first time.
We could keep talking about this for quite a while, but I think we'll have to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, if they want more information, where would they go to find out about the Living Heart Project and all this other stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Well, great. Well, you can go to 3ds.com, the number 3ds.com/heart, and that will take you to the main webpage for the Living Heart Project. It'll also give you links to publications, to the community, and you'll also get links to some of the other projects, the brain and the lung, are through there. You're more than welcome to contact me directly. And my email is steven.levine@3ds.com. And I'm sure there's ways online that people can find me.
Certainly. Okay. Well, I appreciate taking the time to kind of talk through what you've been up to for a while. I mean, I find this project to be incredibly fascinating, and the fact that it's now being used daily in some of the best hospitals in the world is amazing. I think this is exactly the promise of this kind of technology that we've been working for entire careers at this point, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's the important part. I want to really make sure I end on that. And when I presented the project, actually, for the very first time, my first slide was one with people standing on the shoulders of others, and I really want to reflect that our ability to do what we were able to do and our continue is really based on decades of groundwork that people have done. It's really essential, and of course, success comes with the preparation and the right timing. And so we need to continue to do all that fundamental work. But what we've shown with the Living Heart Project is we also need to take that extra step and bring it together and make it work in the real world. And so it's been very exciting to me to be able to add my piece to it and to motivate the other communities, which are so vibrant now, recognizing the potential. So thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this podcast and animating the community.
It's been a lot of fun. So thank you very much. And we'll have links to the project and your email. We'll put those in the show notes for sure. So with that, we'll catch everybody next week. Thank you.